Metroid Prime remains one of the finest crafted games of all time, and easily stands amongst the FPS titans as one of the best ever made. This was the first 3D Metroid, and it left an unforgettable mark on the industry. It's hard for me to even put pen to paper for this one. As a kid, I owned this game and played it, but its atmosphere scared me and creeped me out. I never got very far either, but I knew there was something special about it. The art, music, sense of isolation, loneliness, all work together in perfect harmony to create one of the most unique experiences a player can have in gaming. Ironically, I was halfway through a playthrough of Metroid Prime working on this video when the announcement for the Metroid Prime 4 restart was revealed. It is a perfect time to talk about Prime, why it is so good, and why in 2019 it still remains to be one of the best FPS games ever made. If you've never played Metroid Prime, take the time to. It is an absolute masterpiece. The year is 1994. Super Metroid has just released to unbelievable critical acclaim. Reviews regularly referencing it as the greatest game ever made become more and more common. Super Metroid was so good it defined an entire genre. It placed an emphasis on flawlessly designed world building through player freedom, exploration, unparalleled atmosphere, and a journey that unfolds as you find more abilities and upgrades scattered throughout the world. These upgrades then drive you to go back to areas that were previously unexplorable, reaching into new places on the map, all while a strong sense of isolation creeped at your back every step of the way. Super Metroid was one of a kind and still is worth playing to this day. This is why it's important to note that Metroid Prime isn't actually referred to as an FPS game by its developers or by Nintendo. In Prime, exploration takes precedence over combat. Therefore, it's classified as a first-person adventure game. Fast forward 8 years. 8 long years for Metroid fans. Metroid Prime releases in November 2002. The first 3D Metroid of all time. Nintendo knew how good Prime was. However, they cared so much about the Metroid fanbase at the time that Metroid Fusion released the day after Metroid Prime launched. Fusion was a more traditional 2D Metroid game, created to honor the die-hard 2D Metroid fans. In 2019, when I look back at this choice, it shows just how much Nintendo at the time cared. I can't imagine something similar happening in modern gaming, where an entire game is created with the intent of honoring the traditional expectations of a franchise, while still offering a new innovative package in the form of Prime. But here's the thing. Retro Studios, the company tasked with creating Prime, did the impossible. They did what no one thought could be done. They created a 3D game that honored the foundations of the series past. Prime somehow took the brilliance of Super Metroid and made it work near flawlessly in a 3D space. But it didn't come at an easy cost. Metroid skipped the entirety of the Nintendo 64's lifespan, as the developers and producers behind Metroid struggled to figure out how to best utilize Metroid as hardware improved. Now, the co-creator of Metroid, Yoshio Sakamoto, said he couldn't imagine how the N64 controller could be used to control Samus in a 3D world. Nintendo even approached another outside company to develop a 3D Metroid for the N64, but the story and rumors go that, this studio, they declined, referencing the thought that they could never equal the quality of Super Metroid. Fast forward again to the early years of the GameCube. A small studio out of Austin, Texas named Retro Studios begins work on 4 GameCube titles. It's said that Miyamoto liked one of the conceptual games they had created, which was an FPS. They were offered the project for Metroid Prime. All 4 of those in-development games were canceled as work began on the first 3D Metroid. Now, Nintendo made the music for the game. Retro took care of the art and the engineering, but both Nintendo and Retro teams coordinated on the overall design. The game was originally planned to be a third-person shooter, but Miyamoto emphasized the importance of it being first-person, and the game was actually scrapped and restarted. Not the first time a Metroid game has been scrapped in favor of a full restart, but that's something we'll talk about at the end. After the transition to first person, the team at Retro decided they weren't going to make this a traditional FPS game. Director Mark Pacini stated that they weren't trying to fit into that genre, and I quote, "We had to break down the stereotypes of what a first-person game is and make a fun Metroid game." A stance that is so rare in today's modern game development. Having the courage to push against the tropes of your genre in order to honor the identity of a game you are creating. That's what set Prime apart, and why I would argue how great games push the envelope forward. The FPS genre, in my opinion, has seriously stagnated over the years, as many developers just try and create another good FPS instead of trying to innovate beyond the boundaries of traditional FPS tropes. Now, crunch is never something to be celebrated, but the stories tell a tale of Retro working 80 to 100-hour weeks to reach the deadline for Prime during the last 9 months of development. The game released in late 2002, and as mentioned earlier, critics went wild, scoring many perfect ratings. Prime quickly became the most talked about game in the industry. What's crazy is that Retro's catalog of titles, if you look at it today, it isn't that big. It's pretty much the Prime trilogy and the exceptional modern Donkey Kong Country games. The legacy of the Prime series has cemented the studio as some of the best devs in the space, and that really speaks volumes to the quality of their games. I would argue that certain design elements of Metroid Prime were a decade ahead of its time. Welcome to Firelink Talon 4, your main hub for the entirety of Prime. From this location, you can get anywhere in the game, utilizing brilliantly crafted interweaving pathways that wrap back on themselves and seamlessly tie to other zones within the game, not unlike the way Dark Souls very carefully weaves together its pathways. It's a regular occurrence to complete a long, challenging gauntlet of rooms, only to have a fresh new shortcut unlocked that leads you back to familiar places. That sense of, aha! Just like kicking down the ladder in Dark Souls 1 are all over Metroid Prime. And the world building is absolutely flawless. There isn't a single spoken line of dialogue in the game, creating a strong sense of loneliness, isolation, and immersion. The music, it's so eerie and so well positioned that the game transcends its competitors and becomes an absolute visceral experience. There actually is a very well fleshed out story that occurs within Metroid Prime, but it's told through scannable landmarks, again, very akin to the lore of Dark Souls being told through item descriptions. You can go through all of Prime without reading a single piece of lore, or you can spend hours poring through your logbook piecing the story together. I absolutely love that. It makes the world feel like a real space, and you are experiencing the aftermath of a great calamity, having to put the fragmented pieces together after the fact. Or you can just forego all of that and just romp through rooms without a care in the world. The pacing never gets interrupted with long, boring exposition. Rather, you are in control of the entire experience. You retain agency over Samus, much in the way the early Master Chief was able to essentially be an empty shell for the player to occupy. Samus never gets in the way of the story, at least not in Prime 1. I played through Metroid Prime on the Wii U using the Metroid Prime Trilogy version of the game. The original GameCube version, while excellent, features a single-stick aiming control scheme that at the time was fairly common for console FPS games. Retro, for the Metroid trilogy, went back and added Wii motion controls, as well as improving a lot of performance in some visual aspects. Now, I'm normally the type of person who despises motion controls, but let me say that Prime, the usage of that Wiimote, is bar none one of the best ways to experience a console FPS like this ever. I wouldn't want to use it in a competitive setting, but for a single-player adventure like this, it made Samus's cannon literally feel like an extension of my actual arm. After just an hour, it was extremely intuitive and added to the immersion in a degree that I've not had before in an FPS game. Your time on Talon 4 is spent exploring branching pathways, unlocking upgrades, and then using those upgrades and abilities to open up new areas of the map, the core identity of Metroid. Along your journey, you will battle varied enemy types, encounter a vast array of different climates, locations, artwork, and more, as well as battling tough bosses. These boss fights were the absolute highlight of the adventure for me, and I ended up wishing there were more of them. Each boss requires you to utilize your newfound abilities and have to think. actually think to tackle their unique mechanics. As the game unfolds, areas get harder and harder, as the developers slowly but surely teach you through gameplay how to use your abilities to their fullest extent. The amount of secret passageways, hidden areas, and new discoveries make the world feel light years ahead of any other FPS. Tons of care and thought went into the design of almost every room in the game. Prime also treats you like a mature gamer. It offers only subtle direction from time to time in the form of maybe marking a room on your map. But that's it. It's up to you, Samus, alone on this planet, to figure out where to go and how to get there. Just like Dark Souls, yes, this will be my final reference to it, I promise, you can go almost anywhere on the entire map in whatever order you please once you have a few key abilities unlocked. This in turn allowed the speedrunning community to do incredible sequence breaks and play through sections of the game in an order that a casual player would never think of. It also lends itself to a huge amount of replayability. While yes, there is sort of a predetermined order for those first few key abilities, once you have them, you can pretty much go almost anywhere. Finally, the music adds a sense of identity to every zone, while also adding a sense of sheer terror in some sections. For a game that was made in 2002, the artwork, it's still gorgeous, and at no point did I feel like the game was so dated that a modern player couldn't enjoy it. I will say a few things though. I did have to reference a guide at the later points of the game, as some elements of the constant backtracking did fatigue me without a clear sense of like, where do I go next and how do I collect the necessary items to progress the game. I fully understand that backtracking is a huge part of the Metroid formula, but near the end of the game, I got a little tired of it, honestly. And that's probably just maybe the modern gamer side of me, that impatience coming through, but I would hope that a modern Metroid would be able to address this in a way that doesn't destroy the exploration aspect of Metroid, but can still gently kind of guide the player in clever ways without as much sort of blindless backtracking. So then, Metroid Prime in 2019 is still an absolute masterpiece, and a game any FPS player should experience. I'm beyond happy to hear of Metroid Prime 4's restart. I want you to think about the significance of that. In 2019, Nintendo openly and honestly said to their players that the game that was made wasn't up to their standard, and they didn't think it was deserving of what the Metroid fans desired. In response, they went back to Retro Studios, the original designers of the Prime series, and have now handed over the reins. Yes, this means Metroid players will be waiting a few more years for Prime 4. But it also means that Nintendo still deeply cares about the quality of the Prime series. That's a big deal, especially in comparison to other AAA publishers in the gaming space. I would highly recommend, if you have a Wii or a Wii U, picking up the trilogy and playing it. This was an experience I'll never forget, a defining first-person adventure that has left its mark on history. Thank you very much for watching this video. If you enjoyed, please subscribe for more and hit that little alarm bell. The notifications for sub boxes aren't the greatest. Follow me over on Twitter at BBKDRAGOON. I'd love to talk with you guys there. Also, if you guys enjoy Nintendo-based videos, check out my second channel, which is all about Nintendo Switch content. Link on the screen here. Thank you guys so much for the immense support on the channel over the last few months. It's been crazy. Keep the great video suggestions coming in the comments. I look forward to talking with you all again very soon.